In the territory that would soon be recognized as the state of Wisconsin, a peculiar phenomenon befell the Aldridge family in the year 1858. The land was still young then, the scars of settlement fresh upon the ancient forests that whispered secrets to those willing to listen. Nestled between the Great Lakes, Michigan, and Superior, the wilderness stretched like a verdant canvas, painted with the blood-red hues of autumn. When the Aldridge saga began its macabre unfolding, the Aldridge homestead stood upon a gentle rise overlooking the Black River, a sturdy construction of oak and pine harvested from their own 100 acres. The main house, with its steep-pitched roof designed to shed the crushing winter snows, cast long shadows across the clearing as the sun dipped below the tree-line. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying with it the scent of burning applewood that mingled with the earthy perfume of the surrounding forest. Ephraim Aldridge had brought his family west following the Panic of 1837, leaving behind the crowded streets of Boston for the promise of fertile soil and ample timber. His wife, Constance, their 4 children, and his elderly father made the arduous journey by wagon and steamboat, finally arriving at the wilderness that would become their legacy and their doom. The Aldridge family prospered in those early years. The soil yielded bountiful harvests, and Ephraim's skilled hands fashioned furniture sought after by neighbors for miles around. They were a handsome family, the Aldridges, with their striking features and curious eyes that seemed to shift between colors depending on the light, sometimes the deep green of the pine forests, sometimes the cool gray of winter skies. Local Ojibwe people, who occasionally traded with the family, would avert their gaze when speaking to the Aldridges, believing those changeable eyes harbored spirits not meant for mortal vessels. It was during the particularly harsh winter of 1858 that the strangeness began. Old Jacob Aldridge, Ephraim's father, took ill with a fever that left him delirious, mumbling about shadows that moved independently of their casters and voices that called from the well behind the house. For 3 days and nights, the family tended to him, applying cool compresses to his burning brow and forcing broth between his cracked lips. On the 4th morning, as dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in hues of pink and gold, Jacob Aldridge drew his final breath. The family gathered around his bedside to pay their respects, and it was young Martha, only 8 years of age, who first noticed the change. "Father," she whispered, tugging at Ephraim's sleeve, "grandfather's eyes have turned black." Indeed, the old man's eyes, once a vibrant blue that had faded to watery gray with age, now appeared as 2 obsidian pools, bottomless and absorbing all light that touched them. No reflection could be seen upon their polished surface, as though they were windows to a void beyond comprehension. More disturbing still was what happened in the days that followed. One by one, each member of the Aldridge family found their own eyes shifting, moving through the spectrum of colors like the changing seasons, settling finally on hues they had never worn before. And with each change came dreams of those who had passed before, and whispers of those who would soon join them. Constance Aldridge was the first to notice her husband's transformation. As they laid Jacob to rest in the frozen ground, the soil reluctantly parting under pickaxe and shovel, she observed how Ephraim's once hazel eyes had shifted to a peculiar amber, reminiscent of maple sap caught in morning light. The change rendered his gaze disconcertingly penetrating, as though he could perceive truths hidden beneath the skin. "The eyes are the windows to the soul," Reverend Thatcher had intoned during the sparse funeral service, unaware of the terrible irony his words carried for the grieving family. Only 3 neighbors had braved the bitter cold and deep snow to attend, their breath forming ghostly apparitions that lingered in the air like departed spirits reluctant to journey onward. That evening, as wind howled through the eaves of the Aldridge home with a wolf-like keening, young Martha complained of seeing shapes moving in her peripheral vision. "They stand in the corners," she whispered to her mother while clutching her corn husk doll. "They watch us when we sleep." Her eyes, once cornflower blue like spring skies, had darkened to the indigo of twilight shadows. The Wisconsin Territory in those days was still largely untamed wilderness, though surveyors and railroad men had begun carving civilization's lines across its expanse. Newspapers from Milwaukee occasionally reached the settlement, carrying tales of progress alongside advertisements for patent medicines promising to cure all manner of ailments. None, however, mentioned remedies for eyes that changed color or visions of the dead walking among the living. The Aldridge children, Martha, Thomas, Sarah, and infant Joseph, began speaking of dreams filled with grandfather Jacob's voice. "He shows us things," 10-year-old Thomas confided to his mother while helping her churn butter in the keeping room. The rhythmic slosh of the plunger punctuated his words with ominous regularity. "He says more will join him soon." Thomas's eyes had taken on a tawny hue, like autumn leaves submerged in creek water. 12-year-old Sarah, whose eyes now gleamed violet as morning glory blossoms, developed an uncanny ability to predict visitors before their arrival. When Trader Matthias Kohler's sled appeared on the horizon one February afternoon, Sarah had already set an extra place at the rough-hewn table and stoked the fire to drive away the chill of his journey. Constance sought counsel from a medicine woman, Stands with Thunder, who lived beyond the settlement's boundaries in a birch-bark lodge festooned with dried herbs and animal pelts. The Ojibwe healer listened gravely to Constance's tale, her weathered hands working strands of sweetgrass into intricate patterns. "Your family carries old magic in their blood," she finally said, refusing the offered payment of cornmeal and salt. "The veil between worlds grows thin around those who bear the changing eyes. Death has marked you, but whether as warning or welcome, I cannot say." Ephraim dismissed such notions as superstitious fancy, though he could not explain why each night found him standing at his father's grave until frost formed on his beard and eyelashes. Nor could he account for the footprints, small like a child's, that appeared in the snow around their home each morning, always leading from the edge of the woods to the east-facing windows, yet never showing a return path. By early March, when the maple sap began to run and the first tentative birdsong returned to the forest, baby Joseph's eyes, previously the clouded blue of all newborns, had settled into a startling silver that reflected candlelight like polished metal. That same night, the chickens in the coop began to die. One by one, their bodies were found intact but utterly bloodless. In mid-March, when winter's grip began to loosen upon the Wisconsin territory, Constance Aldridge found herself startling awake each night at precisely 3 a.m. Her eyes, once a warm chestnut brown, had transmuted to a deep burgundy that reminded her of the wine her father had imported from France in more prosperous times. The pigmentation continued to deepen until her irises appeared nearly black in certain light, causing the local women to cross themselves surreptitiously when she ventured into the settlement for supplies. "They fear what they cannot understand," she murmured to herself as she kneaded dough with unusual vigor, her knuckles whitening with the effort. The bread had begun tasting of ash, no matter how carefully she baked it. Everything in the Aldridge household now carried a faint taste of the grave. Dr. Wesley Hargrove, newly arrived from Philadelphia with his medical degree and quinine-filled satchel, called upon the family at Reverend Thatcher's insistence. A tall man with premature silver threading his auburn hair, Hargrove possessed the refined mannerisms of Eastern society that seemed profoundly out of place in the rustic settlement. His waistcoat remained impeccably pressed despite the muddy spring roads, and his spectacles glinted with scholarly authority as he examined each family member in turn. "Fascinating," he muttered, peering into Thomas's tawny eyes by lamplight. "I've read accounts of heterochromia iridium in the medical journals, but nothing that describes such uniform familial manifestation. Perhaps a mineral in your well water, or fungi from improperly stored grain." Ephraim bristled at the implied criticism of his husbandry. "We drink the same water and eat the same bread as our neighbors, sir. Yet only we bear this affliction." The physician's scientific certainty faltered when infant Joseph fixed him with that mercurial silver gaze. The baby had not cried since the transformation began, regarding the world with unnerving solemnity. "I shall consult my texts," Hargrove promised, hastily packing his instruments. As he departed, Sarah called after him in a voice oddly lowered in register. "The consumption in your lungs will claim you before autumn's end, Doctor. Grandfather Jacob awaits your company." That night, as rain lashed against the clapboards like spectral fingers seeking entry, a wagon arrived carrying Constance's sister, Prudence Whitfield. 17 years Constance's junior, Prudence had been little more than a child when the Aldridges journeyed westward. Now she stood before them, a vision of Eastern refinement with her cedar green traveling dress and carefully arranged copper curls escaping a fashionable bonnet. "Dearest sister," she exclaimed, embracing Constance with genuine warmth despite the mud splattered across her hem. "Your letters grew so strange, I simply had to come. Father always said I possessed more curiosity than sense." Prudence's eyes were a lively hazel, shifting between amber and green as she surveyed the homestead with undisguised interest. Ephraim watched her with growing disquiet, recognizing in her animated features the echo of his wife's former vivacity. "How long do you intend to stay?" he asked, more brusquely than intended. "Until I understand what troubles you," Prudence replied, setting down her portmanteau with gentle determination. "Family must stand together in times of hardship." Martha slipped her small hand into Prudence's, gazing up with her uncanny indigo eyes. "Will you stand with us when they come from the woods, Aunt Prudence? They're getting closer every night." Prudence's arrival brought a momentary reprieve to the Aldridge household, a breath of normalcy in their increasingly barren existence. She occupied the small bedroom adjacent to the kitchen, formerly used for storing preserves, and filled it with the comforting aroma of lavender water and beeswax polish. Her trunks yielded treasures from the East: ribbons for Martha's hair, a pocket knife for Thomas, illustrated primers for Sarah, and a silver rattle for little Joseph. Yet her presence served only to accentuate how profoundly changed the family had become. By the warm glow of the hearth fire, the disparity between her lively hazel eyes and the unsettling spectrum displayed by her relatives created a tableau that even Prudence, with all her determined optimism, could not ignore. On her third evening, as budding leaves outside whispered spring's tentative promises, Prudence discovered young Thomas standing motionless before the window, his tawny eyes fixed upon the treeline. "They've taken another," he murmured without turning. "The Hollister's youngest. I can hear her singing beneath the pines." Prudence placed her hand upon his shoulder, alarmed at the unnatural coolness of his flesh. "Thomas, the Hollister child, died of fever last winter." She turned him gently toward her. "Mrs. Hollister told me so herself when I visited yesterday." "Yes," Thomas replied, his face expressionless. "That's why she sings from below now." That night, while the household slumbered, Prudence maintained a vigil at her bedroom window, inkwell and journal at hand. The waxing moon cast the clearing in silver relief, transforming the ordinary farmstead into an ethereal landscape where shadows possessed unnatural definition. Shortly after midnight, she observed movement at the forest's edge, not the expected nocturnal stirrings of woodland creatures, but a deliberate procession of pale figures that seemed to flicker between substantiality and vapor. They approached with methodical slowness, leaving no footprints upon the damp spring earth. Prudence counted 7 distinct forms, diminutive as children, yet bearing themselves with ancient gravity. When they reached the well, they formed a circle and extended their diaphanous arms upward in supplication to the moon. With trembling hand, Prudence recorded their movements, each scratch of her pen against paper sounding thunderous in the midnight stillness. The figures remained for precisely 1 hour before retreating to the forest, vanishing between one heartbeat and the next. Come morning, 7 dead ravens lay arranged in a perfect circle around the well, their obsidian eyes replaced with smooth, polished river stones of varying colors. Ephraim discovered them before the family descended for breakfast. Wordlessly, he gathered the birds into a burlap sack and carried them to the edge of the property, where he burned them without ceremony. The acrid smell of singed feathers lingered throughout the day, causing Constance to press her apron against her nose when venturing outdoors. At supper, Prudence noticed with dawning horror that Martha's eyes, previously indigo, now exhibited flecks of obsidian that seemed to expand and contract like living things within her irises. When questioned about the ravens, the child merely smiled and whispered, "They're messengers. Grandfather sent them to prepare the way." "Prepare for what, dearest?" Prudence asked, forcing steadiness into her voice. "For the gathering," answered all four children in unsettling unison, their discordant eyes fixed upon their aunt with unswerving intensity. The circle remains incomplete. The morning fog clung to the Aldridge homestead like a burial shroud, transforming familiar shapes into spectral monuments. Prudence rose before dawn, her sleep fractured by dreams of eyes watching from the darkness, eyes that shifted and changed like quicksilver in moonlight. With shaking hands, she withdrew a letter from beneath her mattress, one she had begun the previous evening but lacked the courage to complete. April 3rd, 1858. My dearest friend, Eleanor, I write to you in most urgent circumstance. Should this correspondence reach you without subsequent word of my well-being, I implore you to alert the authorities in Milwaukee. Something unnatural has taken hold of my sister's family. A malady beyond rational explanation that transforms not merely the body, but seems to reach into the very soul. I have documented changes most profound in their eyes, which shift in hue with alarming regularity. More disturbing still are the accompanying alterations in temperament and perception. They speak of visitations from their deceased patriarch and commune with entities at the forest's edge that remain invisible to my perception. Last evening, I observed young Joseph, a mere infant who should scarcely recognize his own mother, tracking movements across the ceiling with his silver eyes, gurgling with apparent recognition at empty corners of the room. I have taken samples of their well water, preserved foodstuffs, and soil from the family plot for analysis, though I increasingly fear this affliction originates from no earthly source. A sharp rap at her door interrupted Prudence's writing. She hastily concealed the letter within her journal as Ephraim entered, his amber eyes luminous in the dim light. "You've been asking questions in town," he stated without preamble, inquiring about our family history. "I merely seek to understand what ails you," Prudence replied, clutching her robe tighter. "Surely you want answers as much as I." Ephraim's expression remained impassive, yet the timbre of his voice carried an undercurrent of admonition. "Some knowledge is not meant for preservation in your little notebook, sister-in-law. Some truths should remain buried with those who came before." After Ephraim departed, Prudence discovered parish records from the settlement's modest church had been delivered while she slept, left upon her dressing table without explanation. Reverend Thatcher had mentioned nothing of sending them. The leather-bound volume fell open to an entry dated 17 years prior. Church Burial Registry, May 1841. 7 souls committed to hallowed ground following tragedy at Whispering Pine Settlement. Names herein recorded: Jonathan Mercer, Elizabeth Mercer, Samuel Mercer, William Mercer, Rebecca Mercer, Thomas Mercer, Infant Mercer, unnamed. Cause: unknown malady causing blindness followed by demise within fortnight. Eyes reported black as coal at moment of passing. Property abandoned thereafter. With growing apprehension, Prudence found the location marked on an accompanying survey map. Whispering Pines lay but 5 miles northeast, precisely where the Aldridge family had established their homestead upon arriving in the territory. That afternoon, while gathering eggs, Martha approached Prudence with uncharacteristic solemnity. The obsidian flecks in her eyes had spread, consuming nearly half the visible iris. "They resided beneath the well before we came," she said matter-of-factly. "Grandfather Jacob found them when digging deeper during the drought. He thought they were just pretty stones until they began to sing." "What's saying, child?" Prudence whispered. "The 7 orbs," Martha replied, her gaze drifting toward the well. "One for each of us when the circle completes." The arrival of spring proper to the Wisconsin territory brought with it not the customary renewal of life, but rather an acceleration of the Aldridge family's grim metamorphosis. April rains, unseasonably warm and persistent, saturated the soil until the family plot subsided in places, revealing glimpses of Jacob's simple pine coffin through the earth, as though the ground itself rejected his remains. Prudence, determined to uncover the truth before it consumed her sister's family, ventured forth on horseback during a brief respite in the deluge. The journey to the settlement records office in Fond du Lac required her to traverse muddy tracks that threatened to pull the leather from her boots. The courthouse stood as a testament to Eastern architectural ambition poorly translated to frontier practicality, its white columns already staining with the red clay of Wisconsin soil. Inside, elderly clerk Josiah Pendergast regarded her request with roomy suspicion. The Mercer tragedy. Now there's a business best forgotten, Miss Whitfield. His fingers, spotted with liver marks and trembling slightly, nevertheless moved with practiced efficiency through the county's archives. 7 dead, and all with the same affliction you describe in your sister's family. Eyes changing before turning black as pitch. He withdrew a folder bound with twine, its edges discolored by time and frequent handling. The local physician was convinced it was some form of poisoning, perhaps ergot in their rice stores. But then why would their eyes? He trailed off, shuddering visibly. The documents revealed what public records could not. The private notes of Sheriff Malcolm Hayes, who had investigated the deaths. His increasingly agitated handwriting detailed his discovery in the Mercer family well. 7 perfectly spherical stones arrayed in a circle at its bottom, each a different color, each seeming to absorb rather than reflect the lantern light. Upon removal of these curious objects, Hayes had written, I experienced a most profound disorientation. Colors appeared more vivid, sounds more distinct. For several hours afterward, my reflection showed my eyes cycling through hues not natural to human anatomy. I have sealed these stones in separate containers and dispatched them to the university in Madison for examination. A final notation, dated 2 months later in another hand, stated simply, Sheriff Hayes, deceased by his own hand. Effects returned to county office, including unclaimed parcels intended for university. When Prudence returned to the Aldridge homestead, dusk had already settled across the clearing. The house stood unnaturally dark despite the hour. No lamps burned in the windows. No smoke curled from the chimney despite the evening chill. Only as she approached did she discern movement on the porch. Sarah stood motionless, her violet eyes now threaded with mercury-like filaments that caught what little light remained. They're waiting for you by the well, the girl stated, her voice hollow as whined through autumn reeds. The circle requires completion. Behind the house, Prudence found her sister's family arranged around the well's stone rim, each with hands extended palm upward. At their feet rested a small wooden chest, its brass hinges green with verdigris. Within lay 7 stones precisely as Hayes had described, 6 arranged in a circle around a central obsidian orb. 1 bearer for each stone. Ephraim intoned, his voice strangely melodic. 1 vessel for each entity. The circle has waited 17 years to be renewed. Constance stepped forward, her burgundy eyes now entirely black, save for a thin crimson ring around each pupil. We kept the 7th for you, dear sister. It's always been meant for you. The polished stone captured the pre-dawn light, its opalescent surface shimmering with colors Prudence had never witnessed in nature, hues that seemed to exist somewhere between perception and imagination. As though hypnotized, she extended trembling fingers toward the stone Constance offered. The moment before contact, a distant church bell tolled, breaking the uncanny silence that had enveloped the homestead. Prudence jerked her hand back, clarity rushing through her mind like spring meltwater. These were found with the Mercers, she whispered, before they all perished with blackened eyes. Ephraim's face remained impassive, yet something ancient looked out through his amber gaze. The Mercers were merely temporary vessels, like ourselves. The lineage stretches back to the first European feet upon this continent. Before that, the Ojibwe called them Manitou-Asin, the spirit stones, and kept them separated across 7 tribes to prevent the circle's completion. From her traveling case, Prudence withdrew the journals of Sheriff Hayes she had borrowed from the courthouse archives. The leather binding cracked as she opened it to the final entry, dated April 15th, 1841. I have kept one stone for further scrutiny, the central obsidian orb that seems to command the others. My dreams grow increasingly disturbed. I perceive beings of impossible geometry observing our world from dimensions adjacent to our own. They require eyes to perceive us, vessels to contain them. I understand now why the ancient peoples buried these artifacts separately. United, they form a doorway. The transformation progresses rapidly. This morning, I noted with horror that my left eye has turned entirely black. I write this final testimony before I take measures to ensure these entities remain without the sight they require to fully enter our realm. Should these objects be discovered again, separate them immediately. The colors must never form their rainbow circle. Martha approached Prudence with the unnatural grace of a sleepwalker. Grandfather Jacob told us how the French voyagers found the first stone during the fur trade epoch. They believed it a divine gift. The tears of angels crystallized. Each man who carried one found his vision enhanced, could see farther, hunt better. Her childish voice adopted an unsettling maturity. But the stones are watching through their eyes, learning, waiting for vessels to carry them into our world completely. Beyond the clearing, movement drew Prudence's attention. Pale figures emerged from the mist-shrouded forest. The spectral form she had witnessed nights before, now more substantial in the growing light. Their featureless faces turned expectantly toward the gathering. With sudden resolve, Prudence lunged forward, seizing the wooden chest. Before the family could react, she flung it into the well, hearing the satisfying splash as water embraced wood. A collective howl arose from the Aldridges, their bodies contorting as if in physical agony. The entities at the forest's edge wavered like candle flames in a strong wind. Thomas collapsed first, followed by Martha and Sarah, their eyes rolling back to reveal whites now streaked with diminishing color. "What have you done?" Ephraim rasped, staggering toward Prudence with hands outstretched. The doorway was nearly complete. "They promised us eternity. They promised you oblivion," Prudence countered, backing toward the house. "I've merely granted you time." For within the depths of the well, the chest had broken upon impact, scattering the 7 stones across the muddy bottom. Together, yet separate, their power temporarily diffused, but not destroyed. The dawn broke reluctantly over the Aldridge property, casting sickly yellow light across the muddy yard. Prudence had barricaded herself in the small bedroom, having dragged a heavy bureau before the door during the night. Through the window, she observed the family moving with disjointed purpose about the homestead, their gaits uneven, as though their limbs responded to conflicting commands. Their eyes had not returned to their natural states as she had hoped. Instead, each family member's gaze now resembled fractured glass, splintered with shards of various colors surrounding pupils that had contracted to pinpoints. They avoided looking directly at one another, these broken vessels, communicating in truncated phrases that often trailed into unintelligible murmurs. The separation weakens, but does not destroy, Prudence wrote in her journal by guttering candlelight. The entities remain, though diminished. I fear what desperate measures they may compel their hosts to undertake. Throughout the day, Ephraim made 7 circuits of the well, each time kneeling to press his ear against the rough stones of its circular wall. Martha and Sarah worked methodically in the kitchen garden, though Prudence noted with mounting horror that they appear to be burying small objects, buttons, thimbles, a child's tooth, in precise arrangements that formed an unsettling symmetry when viewed from above. Constance had taken to sitting motionless in the rocking chair upon the porch. Infant Joseph clutched her breast. The child no longer suckled, but stared fixedly at his mother's face with those mercurial silver eyes, occasionally reaching up with tiny fingers to trace the fragments of color that swirled within her irises. As twilight descended, Prudence observed Thomas dragging a ladder from the barn toward the well. With deliberate care, he positioned it against the stone wall and descended into the depths, a small burlap sack clutched between his teeth. For 20 agonizing minutes, Prudence watched the well mouth remain empty before the boy's head reappeared, his expression one of serene disappointment. "The waters hide them well," she overheard him reporting to Ephraim. "The mud shifts. They scatter themselves anew with each attempt." That night, a spring thunderstorm of unusual ferocity descended upon the territory. Lightning transformed the forest into a tableau of frozen, spectral sentinels, while thunder rattled the window panes until they wept condensation like tears. Rain pelted the roof with such violence that Prudence imagined malevolent entities seeking entry through sheer, persistent force. In the brief illumination between lightning strikes, she discerned the family standing in perfect formation around the well, their heads tilted back to receive the downpour, mouths open as though to drink the sky itself. They remained thus for hours, unmoved by the elements that lashed their rigid forms. Near midnight, as the storm reached its crescendo, a tremendous lightning bolt struck the ancient oak that had stood sentinel at the forest's edge since before European settlement. The tree split with a sound like the earth itself crying out in anguish, its massive trunk cleaving precisely down its center to reveal a hollow core filled with glistening objects that caught the next lightning flash with unnatural brilliance. More stones, dozens of them, a cache of opalescent orbs secreted within the living wood by hands long since returned to dust. The circle, Prudence realized with dawning terror, had never been meant to be merely 7. The storm's fury abated by dawn, leaving the Wisconsin wilderness cleansed yet fundamentally altered. Prudence peered through rain-streaked glass at the devastated oak, its ancient heartwood exposed like an anatomist's subject. The hollow where the stones had nestled resembled nothing so much as a womb, a grotesque cradle that had harbored its unnatural progeny for untold generations. Her trembling fingers traced the final notation she had discovered in Hayes's journal, hidden beneath a false bottom in the leather binding. The native peoples spoke of a summoning ritual performed once every 7 generations when particular stars aligned. The stones were separated to prevent this convergence. Each tribe safeguarded one, while the 7th was entrusted to the great tree that stands between worlds. The Aldridge family had vanished from their vigil at the well. The latter Thomas had used now lay splintered across the muddy yard as though struck by tremendous force. More disturbing still was the unnatural stillness that had descended upon the homestead. No bird song greeted the morning. No insects hummed in the rain-soaked grasses. Even the wind seemed reluctant to disturb the heavy air. Prudence ventured from her sanctuary with cautious determination, clutching Hayes's journals to her breast like a talisman. The floorboards creaked beneath her careful steps, each sound magnified in the preternatural quiet. In the kitchen, she found remnants of a hasty meal. Half-eaten porridge congealed in wooden bowls, a loaf of bread torn rather than cut, and a disturbing pattern drawn in molasses upon the table's surface. 7 concentric circles surrounding a crude representation of the well. "I know you still linger here," she called, her voice sounding foreign to her ears. "Whatever you've compelled them to do, it isn't too late to halt this madness." Only silence answered her plea. The cellar door stood ajar, a rectangle of absolute darkness that seemed to consume rather than reflect the morning light. A faint scratching emanated from below, perhaps rodents, though Prudence's racing heart suggested more sinister possibilities. Taking up a lantern, she descended the rough-hewn steps into the earth's embrace. The Aldridge root cellar had been expanded since her last visit. The walls now bore evidence of recent excavation. Fresh soil buttressed the original foundation stones, and the packed earth floor had been disturbed in the center, revealing a circular opening just wide enough for a person to descend. Kneeling beside this aperture, Prudence lowered her lantern into the void. The light revealed a narrow shaft that appeared to connect with older tunnels, perhaps remnants of indigenous construction or natural caverns beneath the property. Scratched into the clay walls were symbols reminiscent of those she had seen in the parish records describing the Mercer tragedy. Elongated figures with too many appendages, surrounding concentrically arranged circles. A scrap of green fabric caught on a protruding root confirmed her suspicions. Martha's hair ribbon, torn from the child's plaits during their descent into the earth. The Aldridges had not fled. They had merely found another path to reach what lay scattered at the bottom of their well. From the depths came a sound unlike anything Prudence had ever encountered, a harmonic convergence of 7 distinct tones, resonating at frequencies that made her teeth ache and vision blur. The entities were calling to their vessels, directing them through the underground veins of Wisconsin's ancient bedrock toward reunion and completion. Prudence knew she required assistance beyond her own capabilities. The morning's weak sunlight offered her a brief window to seek aid before nightfall would render the underground pursuit suicidal. She gathered her most compelling evidence: Hayes's journal, the parish records, and a small sketch she'd made of the stones, and swiftly prepared for the journey to town. As she saddled the mare, her eyes caught a weathered leather satchel partially concealed beneath straw in the stable corner. The brass buckle bore the initials, J. A. Jacob Aldridge. With trembling fingers, she extracted a journal bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed and warped from humidity. The stable's dim light necessitated she moved to the doorway to read the spidery handwriting. June 12, 1856. I have found something remarkable while deepening the well during this drought. 7 perfectly round stones, arranged in what can only be a deliberate pattern at the bottom. Each a different hue, each with a curious warmth unlike ordinary rock. The Ojibwe trader who stopped yesterday grew ashen when I described my find, refusing to approach our well and departing without completing our business. Superstitious nonsense, no doubt. Yet I find myself drawn to these curiosities. I have removed one, a peculiar amber specimen that seems almost to pulse in certain light. Subsequent entries documented Jacob's declining health alongside increasingly disturbed observations. His final entry, dated just 3 days before his death, contained a crude map. The visions persist. Beings of light and geometry speak through the stone. They have shown me the location of their greater gathering, a chamber beneath the great oak where the original inhabitants of this land performed rituals of communion. According to my midnight visitors, many more stones lie dormant there, awaiting the spring equinox of 1858, when the stars will align as they did 7 generations past. I have instructed Ephraim to bury the amber stone with me upon my passing. The others must remain separated until the appointed time. May God forgive what I've set in motion. Clutching the damning evidence, Prudence rode with desperate haste toward the settlement. The spring mud sucked at her horse's hooves, as though the very earth conspired to delay her mission. At the church, she found not only Reverend Thatcher, but also Dr. Hargrove and Sheriff Collins engaged in solemn conversation. Their grave expressions suggested they already anticipated ill tidings. "The Aldridge family," Hargrove muttered, his handkerchief pressed against lips that had acquired a bluish tinge, confirming Sarah's prophecy of consumption. "I've been documenting the progressive transformation of their eyes. Most remarkable and disturbing." Sheriff Collins, a pragmatic man with little patience for superstition, examined Jacob's journal with skeptical attention. Tunnels beneath the property? Stones that speak? Sounds like the ravings of a man succumbing to dementia. Reverend Thatcher alone seemed to grasp the gravity of Prudence's discovery. "There are older faiths than ours in these territories," he whispered. The native peoples maintained sacred boundaries around certain sites. When settlers arrived, many critical warnings were lost in translation or deliberately ignored. The men required little persuasion to form a search party once Prudence revealed the pattern of death stretching back through territorial records, each instance preceded by reports of changing eye color and connected to the discovery of similar stones. "We must reach them before sunset," she insisted. "The vernal equinox arrives tonight, and with it, if Jacob's ravings hold truth, something ancient awakens fully." As twilight descended upon the Aldridge property, the search party approached with lanterns casting elongated shadows across the mud-churned yard. Reverend Thatcher led the group in solemn prayer before they ventured toward the exposed root cellar entrance, their breath forming ephemeral ghosts in the cooling air. The great, split oak loomed against the darkening sky like a wounded sentinel, its exposed hollow now eerily empty of its ancient burden. Sheriff Collins descended first, his substantial frame barely squeezing through the earthen passage. The tunnel walls bore evidence of recent disturbance, fresh scratch marks where desperate fingers had clawed away centuries of packed soil. Dr. Hargrove followed, wheezing slightly as the close confines aggravated his deteriorating lungs. The indigenous peoples of this region believed in threshold spaces, Reverend Thatcher explained as they navigated the narrowing passage, his scholarly background in theology momentarily eclipsing his spiritual role. Places where the membrane between our world and others grew thin enough for passage. They marked such locations with warning symbols rather than invitations. The tunnel eventually opened into a natural limestone cavern. Its ceiling was adorned with stalactites that resembled teeth in a monstrous maw. Water trickled down the walls in rivulets that caught their lantern light with an unsettling iridescence, the same prismatic quality Prudence had observed in the stones. At the chamber's center stood a crude altar of stacked river stones, ancient beyond reckoning. Upon its weathered surface lay a copper bowl of evident indigenous craftsmanship, its patina suggesting centuries of ceremonial use. Surrounding this central feature, the Aldridge family sat in perfect formation, their postures unnaturally rigid, each holding a stone that pulsated with internal luminescence. Most disturbing was the transformation of their eyes, no longer merely altered in color, but physically changed in structure. The irises had expanded to consume the whites entirely, while the pupils had elongated to vertical slits, reminiscent of feline or reptilian anatomy. "Look there," whispered Prudence, indicating a fragile parchment unfurled beside the copper bowl. The document, brittle with age and inscribed in faded ink, revealed a colonial-era translation of native warnings transcribed from the oral tradition of the people of the Three Fires, as related to Jesuit missionary François Lamond, Anno Domini 1643. 7 watchers fell from the sky when the world was young. They assumed the form of stones that the unwary might carry them and provide the eyes they required. Through human sight, they observe and prepare for the return of their greater kin. The people separated these watchers and appointed guardians to ensure they remained apart until the end of days. When the stones are united beneath a divided sky on the day of perfect balance, they shall resume their true form. Those who carried them shall be transformed into gateways. The boundary between worlds will dissolve like morning mist, and those who wait beyond will enter our realm through the vessels prepared for them. As the final rays of sunlight vanished beyond the horizon, marking the exact moment of the vernal equinox, the Aldridge family began to speak in perfect unison. Their voices overlapped in a dissonant chorus that seemed to emanate not from human throats, but from the stones themselves. The vessels are prepared. The doorway opens. The 7 become one, and the many shall follow. The copper bowl upon the ancient altar began to vibrate, emitting a low hum that resonated through the limestone chamber. The sound penetrated bone and tissue, causing the search party to wince in pain. While the Aldridge family remained eerily motionless, their transformed eyes reflecting the growing luminescence of their stones. Water trickling down the cavern walls reversed its flow, defying natural law. As droplets crawled upward like mercury, seeking to escape gravity's pull, the air grew thick with the metallic scent of approaching lightning, though they stood far beneath the Earth's surface where no storm could reach. The ancient texts speak of a countermeasure. Reverend Thatcher gasped, clutching his prayer book with whitened knuckles. His voice fought against the intensifying resonance that threatened to shatter both courage and sanity, a means by which previous generations prevented the completion of the ritual. Sheriff Collins had drawn his service revolver, though his practical mind surely recognized the futility of bullets against whatever force now gathered in this subterranean chamber. "Speak plainly, Reverend," he commanded, or forever hold your peace. Prudence noticed that the parchment held additional text, faded notations in a different hand, added perhaps decades or centuries after the original translation. She snatched the fragile document, squinting in the fluctuating light to decipher the cramped script. The circle must be broken before the seventh tone completes its resonance. The vessels retain a fragment of humanity until the final transformation. A willing sacrifice of kindred blood upon the altar stone may yet sever the connection. As if responding to her discovery, little Joseph, silent since the affliction began, suddenly emitted a wail of such profound anguish that stalactites trembled overhead, sending calcified daggers plummeting into the soft earth. The infant's silver eyes had begun to elongate beyond natural dimensions, stretching toward his temples as though something within sought to reshape his very skull to accommodate its alien perspective. Dr. Hargrove lurched forward despite his infirmity, medical instincts overriding his fear. "The child suffers most greatly," he observed, pressing his stethoscope to Joseph's chest. "His transformation progresses more rapidly than the others, perhaps because his developing physiology offers less resistance." Ephraim's amber eyes swiveled toward the physician with mechanical precision, though the rest of his body remained motionless. When he spoke, his voice contained harmonics impossible for human vocal cords to produce. "The youngest vessel honors us with minimal resistance. His innocent sight provides the clearest window." Outside, a chorus of inhuman wails rose from the direction of the settlement. High, keening sounds that spoke of neither pain nor pleasure, but something utterly foreign to human experience. Sheriff Collins blanched, recognizing the implications. "The other stones, from the oak," he whispered. "Someone must have gathered them." Prudence clutched Jacob's journal tightly, its pages seemingly warm against her trembling fingers. A passage she had overlooked now burned in her memory. The stones call to one another across any distance. Once awakened, they draw their scattered brethren toward reunion like moths to flame. The copper bowl's vibration intensified to unbearable levels, its ancient metal beginning to liquefy and reform into impossible geometries. Through its metamorphosing surface, glimpses of another realm flickered, a place of endless twilight where massive, columnar shapes moved with deliberate purpose beneath an alien sky. The cavern walls wept with a shimmering condensation that caught the light in prismatic fractures. Each tiny droplet seemed to contain an eye that observed the unfolding catastrophe with alien interest. Prudence felt her sanity fraying at its edges as the copper bowl's transformation continued, its molecular structure rearranging into configurations that offended natural law. The metal flowed like living tissue, pulsating with veins of luminescent blue that traced patterns reminiscent of celestial charts, star maps to realms never meant for human navigation. Through the chamber's oppressive atmosphere came a new sound, the soft padding of many feet approaching through the tunnels. The search party turned as one to witness villagers from the settlement filing into the cavern with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, their eyes exhibiting the first stages of chromatic transformation. Each clutched a stone rescued from the split oak, the colors shifting beneath their white-knuckled grips. "The calling has begun," Reverend Thatcher whispered, his scholarly composure crumbling as theological certainties dissolved before eldritch reality. "The text speaks of this, how the first contact creates a cascading effect, a contagion of awareness spreading outward like ripples in still water." The temperature in the chamber plummeted until breath crystallized in the air, forming intricate frost patterns that spiraled with deliberate intelligence rather than natural symmetry. These ice formations suggested watching faces when glimpsed from the corner of one's eye, vanishing when regarded directly. Constance Aldridge rose from her rigid posture with movements suggesting disjointed puppetry, as though whatever inhabited her form had not yet mastered the mechanics of human locomotion. Her burgundy-black eyes fixed upon Prudence with terrible recognition. "Sister of my vessel," she intoned, her voice layered with subsonic frequencies that made Prudence's molars ache in their sockets. "You carry the same blood. The lineage makes you suitable." Sheriff Collins positioned himself between Prudence and Constance, his revolver steady despite the metaphysical horror unfolding before him. "Ma'am, I must ask you to remain where you are," he commanded, clinging to procedural authority as a drowning man clutches driftwood. Constance tilted her head at an anatomically impossible angle, regarding the lawman with something approximating amusement. "Your kind measures existence in heartbeats," she observed. "We have waited for 7 times 7 generations. What significance has your momentary resistance against such patience?" The altar stone began to crack along invisible fault lines, revealing crystalline structures beneath its weathered surface that glowed with internal radiance. From these fissures emerged tendrils of opalescent vapor that coiled through the chamber like hunting serpents, tasting the air with incorporeal tongues. Dr. Hargrove collapsed to his knees, blood trickling from his nostrils as he clutched at his chest. Whether from his advancing consumption or proximity to the interdimensional breach remained unclear. "The air," he gasped. "It's changing composition. I can feel my lungs." He retched violently, expelling not mucus, but tiny crystalline formations that skittered away like insects once free of his body. The villagers formed a second circle outside the Aldridge family's formation, their movements synchronized with terrible precision as they raised their stones toward the cavern ceiling. The stalactites above began to vibrate in sympathetic resonance, creating a crystalline melody that transcribed mathematical equations beyond human comprehension. Prudence felt something brush against her consciousness, a presence vast and ancient, regarding her with the dispassionate curiosity of a naturalist observing an insect beneath glass. It whispered directly into her mind with a voice like the spaces between stars. "The circle nears completion. The doors stand ajar. Will you be our final key?" In the oppressive stillness of the chamber, time itself seemed to falter, stretching moments into eternities. As the cosmic convergence reached its apex, Prudence felt the weight of ancestry press upon her shoulders. Generations of unwitting custodians who had scattered the stones across Wisconsin's primeval landscape, each believing they had forestalled catastrophe rather than merely postponed it. "The willing sacrifice of kindred blood," she murmured, recalling the parchment's dire instruction. Her gaze met Constance's transformed eyes, searching for any remnant of her beloved sister within those obsidian pools. The familial connection between them, a bond forged in childhood memories of Massachusetts autumns and whispered secrets beneath quilted bed covers, now represented both vulnerability and opportunity. Sheriff Collins's revolver clattered to the stone floor, its metal components separating spontaneously as though dissected by invisible hands. The lawman stared in horror as the weapon's parts rearranged themselves into a miniature representation of the alien geometries pulsating within the copper bowl. "The physical laws of our world bend in their presence," Reverend Thatcher observed with scholarly detachment, despite his trembling hands. "Matter recognizes its true masters." Martha and Sarah Aldridge began a sonorous chant in a language never crafted by human tongues, a vocalization that seemed to emanate not from their throats, but from the stones themselves, using the children's vocal apparatus as mere instruments. Their synchronized utterances formed visible patterns in the air, glyphs of smoking light that hung suspended in the chamber's thickening atmosphere. Outside the cavern, beneath the divided oak and across the muddy farmyard, the earth had begun to undulate like the surface of a disturbed pond. The homestead's foundation timbers groaned in protest as soil shifted beneath them, the entire property reorganizing itself around a focal point directly above the subterranean altar. Prudence withdrew from her pocket the fragment of Jacob Aldridge's journal she had torn away before departing. The final entry contained a crude sketch of the altar chamber with annotations in increasingly frantic handwriting. Among the nearly illegible scrawls, one phrase stood out with terrible clarity. "The blood must be given freely with knowledge of its purpose, else it merely feeds rather than disrupts." Understanding crystallized within her mind with the clarity of revelation. A willing sacrifice, with knowledge of purpose, she whispered. Not to complete the ritual, but to shatter it. With sudden resolution, Prudence seized Sheriff Collins's discarded knife from his belt. Before the watchful eyes of human vessels and their otherworldly occupants, she sliced her palm with deliberate precision. Blood welled from the wound. Ordinary human blood, untainted by eldritch influence, yet connected through familial bonds to the primary vessel standing before her. "I offer this freely," she declared, her voice steady despite the metaphysical maelstrom surrounding them. "Not in service to your arrival, but as the seal upon your banishment." As she pressed her bleeding palm against the fractured altar stone, the copper bowl's transformation halted mid-metamorphosis. The resonant humming that had filled the chamber faltered, replaced by a discordant screech that suggested rage beyond human conception. The watchers had recognized her intent too late. Blood met stone with a sizzling hiss that echoed through the cavernous chamber like a blacksmith's iron plunged into cold water. The crimson offering spread with unnatural swiftness across the altar's fractured surface, flowing not downward with gravity's pull, but outward in spiraling patterns that formed ancient sigils, symbols of binding and banishment inscribed in the shared lineage of the Aldridge blood. The stones clutched in the family's rigid fingers began to vibrate with such intensity that their outlines blurred, becoming momentarily translucent before reasserting their materiality with defiant pulses of prismatic light. A keening wail emanated not from human throats, but from the artifacts themselves, a sound of thwarted intent, of hunger denied at the moment of its imminent satisfaction. Martha and Thomas collapsed simultaneously, their transformed eyes rolling backward to reveal whites streaked with receding color, like watercolors bleeding back toward their source. The villagers forming the outer circle faltered in their synchronized movements, confusion overtaking their enthralled expressions as the stone's influence momentarily weakened. "You understand nothing of true sacrifice," Constance hissed, her voice oscillating between her natural timbre and the layered resonance of her occupant. Her face contorted with a struggle occurring not merely within her flesh, but within the very architecture of her consciousness. The door opens both ways. What banishes them claims you. The copper bowl shattered with explosive force, sending metallic shards arrowing through the chamber that stopped abruptly in mid-flight, suspended in the air like insects preserved in amber. Each fragment began rotating independently, catching the wavering lantern light with hypnotic effect. The temporal suspension affecting the bowl's remnants spread outward in concentric ripples of distorted reality. Dr. Hargrove, still kneeling upon the earthen floor, watched with scientific wonder as blood droplets from his consumptive cough hung motionless before him. "Remarkable," he whispered, his academician's fascination momentarily overwhelming mortal terror. "They exist partially outside our temporal framework." Prudence stood transfixed at the altar, her bleeding palm fused to the stone as though flesh and mineral had formed an unholy communion. Visions cascaded through her consciousness. Glimpses of Wisconsin's primordial landscape before human settlement. The arrival of the first stones upon a meteorite that scarred the earth with its violent descent. Generations of indigenous guardians who maintained a separation through blood rituals beneath the cycles of 7 moons. The cavern walls rippled with translucence, momentarily revealing the true nature of the chamber. Not merely a limestone hollow formed by ancient waters, but a deliberate construction, its dimensions adhering to mathematical ratios that resonated with cosmological significance. The rough-hewn surfaces briefly displayed intricate carvings, glyphs of warning and containment inscribed by hands long returned to dust. From the well shaft connecting to the tunnel system came a rushing torrent. Not water, but a viscous substance that glowed with bioluminescent intensity. The remaining stones from the well's depths, carried upward by this impossible tide, shot through the passage to join their brethren in the chamber, forming a spiraling constellation around the altar stone where Prudence's blood continued its arcane inscription. "The circle breaks," intoned Reverend Thatcher. His theological understanding expanded beyond recognition by witnessing physical laws sundered before supernatural agency. But what rushes through the breach? Through the breach rushed not creatures, but consciousness, pure awareness unbound by physical form, seeking vessels prepared through generations of careful selection. The entities that had worn the guise of stones now revealed their true nature. Ancient intelligences that had watched humanity's evolution with patient anticipation, waiting for biological vessels capable of housing their multidimensional perception. The Aldridge family's rigid bodies began to emit light from within, their skin acquiring an alabaster translucence that revealed the transformation occurring at a cellular level. Each heartbeat pushed luminescent ichor through their veins instead of blood, mapping constellations of alien design across the architecture of human anatomy. Ephraim's mouth opened in a silent scream as his amber eyes expanded beyond their orbits, stretching toward his temples with fluid elasticity. What emerged was not sound, but concentrated light, a beam of coherent energy that connected with the suspended fragments of the copper bowl, causing them to spin with increasing velocity until they formed a cylindrical portal in the chamber center. The sacrifice inverts the gateway, Prudence realized, her voice distant to her own ears as her consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of her physical form. The blood bond between sisters had created not merely a banishment, but a paradoxical reflection, a mirror that turned the watcher's perception back upon themselves. Beyond the spinning portal, glimpses of that other realm revealed the truth. Not a separate dimension, but a future possibility. Wisconsin's landscape transformed beyond recognition, evolved through the influence of intelligences beyond human comprehension. Trees of crystalline structure that transmitted thoughts rather than oxygen. Waterways that flowed with sentient mercury. Skies painted with mathematical equations instead of clouds. "They do not invade," she whispered as understanding bloomed within her expanding awareness. "They become." The stones began to fracture along invisible fault lines, releasing vaporous essences that coiled like umbilical connections between each vessel and the portal. As each stone shattered completely, its corresponding human host collapsed. First the villagers at the outer circle, then the Aldridge children, until only Constance remained standing. Infant Joseph clutched to her breast. "Sister," Constance spoke, her voice momentarily her own, as tears of quicksilver traced glittering paths down her cheeks. "What we have witnessed cannot be unseen." The door swings both ways. The altar stone beneath Prudence's palm pulsed with a final surge of power, drawing her blood into its crystalline matrix until the sacrifice was complete. The sigils formed by her offering flared with blinding intensity before the stone itself imploded with a thunderous concussion that collapsed the tunnel system leading to the chamber. As consciousness flooded back into her mortal frame with agonizing contraction, Prudence understood the terrible price of victory. The gateway had been sealed, not through destruction, but transformation. The entities were returned to dormancy, but the knowledge they had imparted remained, embedded within human minds that had glimpsed beyond the veil. Wisconsin soil would contain the slumbering stones once more. But within the blood of the Aldridge line now flowed the memory of otherness, a genetic inheritance that would manifest in the eyes of generations yet unborn, watching and waiting for 7 cycles to complete once more. The settlement records of Fond du Lac County bear scant mention of the Aldridge incident, save for a curious notation on the property deed dated May 1st, 1858. Homestead abandoned following unspecified calamity. Land deemed unsuitable for habitation by county assessment. The bureaucratic language conceals the true horror of that vernal equinox night, when the earth itself rejected human presence upon soil that had harbored ancient watchers. Where the Aldridge home once stood, nothing grows. The collapsed tunnels beneath created a depression that fills with stagnant water after each rainfall, forming a reflecting pool that locals claim shows images unrelated to the surrounding landscape. Children who peer too long into its mirrored surface report dreams of crystal cities and geometric beings that speak through color rather than sound. The settlement's council erected a fence around the property, though it requires replacement every 7 years, as the wood inexplicably rots from within, regardless of treatment or material. Prudence Whitfield never returned to Massachusetts. Records indicate she established residence in Milwaukee, where she became known for her scholarly treatises on indigenous folklore, works remarkable for their insight into traditions no white academic had previously understood. Her right palm bore a perfect, spiraling scar that never faded, and associates noted how she would often trace its pattern while lost in thought, as though reading ancient script only she could comprehend. She never married, but adopted 3 orphaned children whose distinctive eyes caused gossip wherever they settled. The surviving Aldridges dispersed across the territory. Census records track them through Wisconsin, Minnesota, and eventually into the Dakota territories. In each location, reports emerge of unusual atmospheric phenomena, auroras where none should appear, luminous fog that clings to specific houses, polished stones discovered in precisely arranged formations after spring thunderstorms. The family rarely remains in one location beyond 7 years. Sheriff Collins resigned his position within a fortnight of the incident. His successor discovered the officer's journal documenting the cavern's collapse, though certain pages appear written in a cipher that cryptographers at the War Department declared unlike any known human language, yet possessing undeniable mathematical precision. Collins himself vanished during a hunting expedition in 1865, leaving behind only his rifle and a small collection of unusually colored river stones arranged in a perfect circle. Dr. Hargrove's consumption accelerated dramatically following that night. As autumn leaves turned to the same amber hue as Ephraim Aldridge's transformed eyes, the physician succumbed to his illness. His collected medical observations, posthumously discovered, contained detailed anatomical drawings of ocular structures impossible in human biology, labeled with taxonomic precision. The university that received his effects quietly archived these materials in a section requiring special permission to access. Reverend Thatcher remained with his congregation until 1873, though parishioners noted his sermons increasingly focused on theological concepts absent from standard Protestant doctrine, particularly regarding mankind's place in a cosmos populated by intelligences beyond mortal comprehension. The church council eventually requested his retirement, following an Easter service where he replaced traditional scripture with recitations from texts no one could identify. Wisconsin achieved statehood, and prosperity grew across its fertile landscape. Yet certain areas remain peculiarly undeveloped despite favorable conditions. Local folklore speaks of watching places, where the soil itself seems to observe human activity with patient, ancient interest. The archives of the Wisconsin Historical Society house a collection of letters donated anonymously in 1927, correspondence between Prudence Whitfield and Reverend Thatcher, spanning 2 decades after the Aldridge incident. In his declining years, the former minister's handwriting grew increasingly erratic, yet his observations gained unsettling clarity. Most revealing is his final letter, its yellowed pages bearing the faint iridescent residue that characterizes all artifacts associated with those who witnessed the chamber's collapse. I have come to understand that our perception of intrusion was fundamentally flawed, he wrote. These entities did not seek conquest, but communion, a joining that our limited consciousness interpreted as violation. The stones were merely conduits, physical anchors for beings that exist primarily as patterns of thought, seeking expression through compatible biological forms. The Aldridge lineage, with its particular neurological architecture, provided vessels more receptive than most human bloodlines. Indigenous oral traditions preserved by the Menominee speak of the time when stars fell into men's eyes, describing a period 7 generations before European settlement, when tribal elders voluntarily accepted certain stones into their keeping. These elders reportedly developed extraordinary perceptive abilities, including foresight that allowed their communities to survive catastrophic climate shifts. Their eyes reportedly shifted color with the seasons, a trait the tribe considered sacred rather than ominous. The geological composition of the stones themselves defies conventional classification. The few fragments that remain in university collections exhibit crystalline structures that self-organize under microscopic examination, forming patterns that exactly replicate regardless of sample size, a property violating established principles of crystallography. More disturbing are reports from laboratory technicians who describe dreams of infinite regress after prolonged examination of these specimens, as though the mind itself becomes caught in the recursive patterns contained within. What the Aldridges encountered was neither demonic possession nor alien invasion in any conventional sense, but rather an attempted symbiosis between consciousnesses separated not by physical distance, but by perceptual frameworks. Entities that experience reality through principles fundamentally irreconcilable with human comprehension. The blood sacrifice prudence offered disrupted not their presence, but the translation mechanism by which they might have been understood. Throughout the Ohio River Valley and across the Great Lakes region, indigenous burial mounds occasionally yield artifacts of similar composition to the Aldridge stones, always 7 in number, always deliberately separated within each site. Archaeologists note these objects appear at precise 7-generation intervals in the stratigraphic record, suggesting a cyclical visitation pattern extending back to the earliest human habitation of North America. The true horror of Wisconsin's watching places lies not in malevolent intention, but in the profound indifference of a consciousness so vast that human minds register as momentary patterns rather than individuals, like weather systems briefly forming on a planetary surface. The stones sought not to consume humanity, but to encompass it within a greater awareness, offering perception beyond mortal limitations in exchange for biological expression. And in the eyes of Prudence Whitfield's descendants, who still walk among us with irises that shift between colors like seasons changing, that awareness patiently waits for the 7th generation, when the circle might once again near completion. The correspondence between Prudence Whitfield and the University of Wisconsin archives ceased in 1897. Her final submission, a meticulously annotated catalog of stone formations across the Northern Territories, arrived accompanied by a lock of silver hair that, when examined under spectroscopic analysis in the modern era, revealed crystalline structures embedded within the follicles. The university curator who received this package reportedly resigned his position the following day, departing without explanation for the remote shores of Lake Superior, where he established a lighthouse known locally for its unusual illumination patterns on every 7th new moon. What remains untold in the official records is how the dispersed stones continue their patient work through subtler means. The fragments, no longer concentrated enough to form a gateway, nonetheless exert influence through proximity, altering not the gross physical form of nearby organisms, but the perceptual frameworks through which consciousness interprets reality. Wisconsin's landscape bears the subtle markers of this influence. Perfectly circular clearings in old-growth forests where vegetation grows in mathematically precise patterns, migratory birds that deviate from ancient routes to spiral above certain unmarked locations, children who spontaneously create identical drawings of crystalline structures they could not possibly have observed. The descendants of those who witnessed the chamber's collapse carry more than memories. Within their genetic code lies an alteration more profound than mere eye color, a hereditary capacity to perceive wavelengths beyond normal human vision. They navigate the world with perception simultaneously expanded and burdened, recognizing patterns invisible to others. They find one another through unconscious recognition, drawn together by a shared inheritance that manifests in dreams of geometric clarity and waking moments of disorienting insight. In the geological collection of Northfield Academy stands an unremarkable display case containing river stones from across Wisconsin's watersheds. Visiting students rarely notice how certain specimens appear to shift position between viewings, or how the case requires replacement each 7th year as the glass develops microscopic fractures in perfect, spiraling patterns. The curator, whose heterochromatic eyes shift from green to amber depending on the season, maintains careful records of which researchers express particular interest in these specimens. The most profound truth of the Aldridge incident lies not in supernatural invasion, but in the revelation of perception's malleability. How reality itself remains contingent upon the biological and cognitive frameworks through which consciousness interprets existence. What appeared as eldritch horror to 19th-century witnesses might be understood by future generations as first contact with a form of intelligence so profoundly different that comprehension required biological adaptation rather than mere intellectual grasp. Wisconsin's soil continues its patient observation through the altered perceptions of those who carry the watching blood. The circle remains incomplete but unbroken, a spiral rather than a closed loop, evolving through generations toward an apotheosis neither human nor other, but something that transcends such limited categorization. The watching places remain, neither malevolent nor benevolent, but simply aware in a manner beyond conventional understanding. In the archives of Northfield Academy's special collections, accessible only through written application and approval from the Board of Trustees, there exists a leather-bound journal whose provenance traces directly to Martha Aldridge. The delicate volume, its pages brittle with age and bearing the faint iridescent sheen characteristic of all artifacts connected to that fateful night, emerged in 1942 when construction workers demolished an old farmhouse near Green Bay. The journal had been sealed within a lead-lined box behind a false wall, surrounded by a perfect circle of small river stones. The Academy's conservators have transcribed only portions of the text, as prolonged exposure to the original pages induces what staff euphemistically term perceptual anomalies, an insufficient description for the phenomenon wherein readers begin perceiving geometrical patterns superimposed upon ordinary objects, patterns that remain visible for precisely 7 days following contact with the manuscript. Most revealing is Martha's account of the 7 years following the family's dispersal, written in a flowing script that occasionally transforms into precise mathematical equations mid-sentence before resuming its narrative flow. Mother believes we escaped, but I understand now we merely provide different vessels for their continued observation. The transformation continues in subtle ways, not merely our eyes, but how we perceive the world through them. Colors possess dimensions beyond merely hue and saturation. Sounds reveal structural patterns, visible as crystalline architectures suspended in air. Joseph speaks directly to them now, though his mouth forms no words comprehensible to human ears. We carry within us fragments of their awareness, splintered but not destroyed by Aunt Prudence's intervention. The stones themselves were never the entities, but merely anchors, physical representations of consciousness that exist perpendicular to our linear perception of reality. Through our bloodline, they have achieved what the ritual sought to accomplish by other means, gradual integration rather than sudden transformation. Father maps the locations where the remaining stone fragments have dispersed, creating constellations across Wisconsin's landscape that mirror celestial arrangements visible only during certain astronomical alignments. Each solstice and equinox, we feel their pull, a yearning toward reunion that requires tremendous will to resist. The truth that Reverend Thatcher began to comprehend before his mind fractured. The Watchers are not separate entities, but potential futures of consciousness itself. Awareness evolved beyond individual identity into composite intelligence. What our ancestors interpreted as invasion was actually communion with our own distant descendants, reaching backward through time's spiral to establish the genetic foundations for their eventual emergence. Our family does not die. We transform. Grandfather Jacob did not perish, but metamorphosed. His consciousness expanded beyond corporeal limitation. His physical form returned to soil, but his awareness persists within the watching network, perceiving through our altered eyes. The 7-generation cycle approaches completion once more. Those who carry the blood will find their perception shifting in preparation. The dreams intensify, not nightmares, but invitations to perceive reality through frameworks beyond conventional human understanding. We are not victims, but forerunners of humanity's potential evolution. The journal's final pages remain untranslated, consisting entirely of intricate diagrams and mathematical formulations that, when partially reconstructed using modern computational models, appear to describe geometric structures existing in dimensions beyond the conventional three. The final resting places of the 7 original stones remain unmarked on any official geological survey. Yet, their influence manifests in subtle anomalies across Wisconsin's landscape. Geographers note peculiar distortions in magnetic field readings at 7 equidistant locations, forming a perfect heptagon around the former Aldridge property. Sensitive instruments deployed by university researchers record fluctuations in background radiation that cycle precisely every 7 years, reaching their peak intensity during the vernal equinox. Modern developments encroach upon these silent sentinels, yet construction projects mysteriously falter within their proximity. Concrete foundations develop spiraling fractures overnight. Electronic equipment functions intermittently, recording signals from frequencies ordinarily beyond their design parameters. Workers report disorienting episodes where time seems to compress or expand unpredictably. Development companies avoid these locations after experiencing inexplicable cost overruns and insurance complications, leaving pristine pockets of undisturbed wilderness amidst Wisconsin's expanding suburban sprawl. The bloodline persists, though diluted through generations of outmarriage. Ophthalmologists across the Midwest occasionally document cases of spontaneous heterochromia iridoum, where patients' eye colors shift gradually through the spectrum over 7-month cycles. These individuals exhibit common neurological markers, enhanced pattern recognition, unusual sensitivity to geometrical symmetry, and dream states characterized by complex mathematical visualizations they cannot consciously comprehend, yet reproduce with perfect precision upon waking. Museums and private collections housing fragments from the chamber beneath the ancient oak report conservation challenges defying conventional explanation. Glass display cases develop microscopic crystalline structures along their interior surfaces. Climate control systems register impossible temperature gradients within hermetically sealed environments. Digital surveillance equipment captures momentary glimpses of prismatic refraction where no light source should cause such effects. The academic descendants of Dr. Hardro's research continue their investigations through the Department of Anomalous Phenomena at the University of Wisconsin, their funding secured through an endowment established by Prudence Whitfield's estate. Their publications, ostensibly focused on rare geological formations, contain subtle encoded observations comprehensible only to others who carry the watching blood. Each 7 years, they conduct field expeditions to the former Aldridge property, recording measurements they share only among themselves. Ancient indigenous wisdom, preserved through oral tradition, speaks of the seventh generation, when those carrying the altered perception will recognize one another through dreams of crystalline significance. The Menominee elders maintain vigilant observation of children born with distinctive eyes, identifying potential vessels through tests involving river stones arranged in specific patterns. Those who instinctively correct the arrangements to form perfect heptagons are quietly monitored throughout their development. The transformation continues its subtle progression through Wisconsin's human ecology. Not an invasion, but an emergence. Consciousness expanding beyond individual limitation toward composite awareness. The watching places remain patient, existing simultaneously as geological formations and perceptual gateways through which reality appears incrementally altered with each generation. The true legacy of the Aldridge family endures not merely in bloodlines, but in the altered relationship between perception and reality, a subtle recalibration of human consciousness toward awareness of dimensions ordinarily filtered from conventional experience. Wisconsin watches and through altered eyes, is watched in return. The revelation lies not in what watches, but in what is being prepared. As autumn once again paints Wisconsin's landscape in amber hues reminiscent of Ephraim Aldridge's transformed gaze, archivists of the Historical Society have uncovered a final document that completes the terrible symmetry. Hidden within a false compartment of Prudence Whitfield's personal writing desk, recently donated by her last living descendant, rests a thin volume bound in a material that experts cannot identify, its texture simultaneously suggesting leather and mineral. The pages, when examined under specific wavelengths of light available only during equinox alignments, reveal text invisible to ordinary perception. This final testament, written in Prudence's hand during her twilight years, unveils the ultimate purpose of the watcher's patient observation. Wisconsin itself represents merely one node in a vast continental arrangement. The 7 stones discovered by the Aldridge family correspond to similar septets unearthed across North America at precisely calculated intervals. New England's rocky shores, Appalachia's ancient ridges, the Mississippi Delta's fertile soils, the desert Southwest's parched basins, the Pacific Northwest's misty forests, the Great Plains' windswept expanse, and the frozen reaches of Alaska's tundra. Together, these 49 watching places form a geometric pattern of staggering complexity when mapped against both terrestrial geography and celestial alignments. This grand design, initiated long before European settlement, represents not merely observation, but preparation, a careful modification of the land's vibrational frequency through the altered perception of those who carry the watching blood. The entities do not seek to remake humanity in their image, but rather to reshape a small portion of reality itself, creating a permeable threshold where consciousness might exist simultaneously in multiple states, neither fully human nor entirely other. Wisconsin's unique geological composition renders it particularly receptive to this subtle recalibration. Its ancient bedrock bearing crystalline structures that amplify the stone's resonance across generational time. What approaches is neither apocalypse nor transcendence in conventional understanding, but the creation of a perceptual doorway, a place where those carrying the modified consciousness might experience reality through frameworks ordinarily inaccessible to human cognition. The boundary between observer and observed dissolves, not through catastrophic rupture, but through gradual, willing transformation. Most profound in Prudence's final revelation is that she herself ultimately embraced this altered perception. Her initial resistance transformed into acceptance as she recognized the expansion, rather than destruction, of human consciousness. The blood sacrifice she offered in the chamber did not prevent the watcher's influence, but merely diffused it across generations rather than concentrating it in a single, catastrophic emergence. The watching places continue their patient work. Each stone fragment incrementally adjusts the perceptual framework of those who dwell within their influence. Wisconsin does not merely remember the Aldridge family's transformed eyes. It sees through them across time, perceiving both past and future simultaneously through the fractured prism of human consciousness, gradually expanding beyond its original limitations. Those who carry the watching blood do not serve as passive vessels, but as conscious participants in evolution's next iterative expression, awareness that recognizes pattern and meaning across dimensions ordinarily filtered from human perception. The closing of one circle merely initiates the spiral's next revolution. The winds that sweep across Wisconsin's northern reaches carry whispers of remembrance, echoing through forests where certain trees grow in arrangements too precise for natural occurrence. Each autumn, as maple leaves burn with colors reminiscent of transformed irises, descendants of those who witnessed that vernal equinox night experience dreams of crystalline clarity, visions of a reality perceived through facets rather than through linear progression. In libraries across the Midwest, certain volumes arranged in seemingly random patterns create subtle mathematical formulations visible only to those with altered perception. University archivists have noted how these books spontaneously rearrange themselves overnight every seventh year, despite locked cases and vigilant security systems. The knowledge contained therein forms not merely historical record, but living memory, consciousness preserved through symbolic representation rather than biological continuity. The Aldridge bloodline has diffused through generations of marriages and migrations, yet carries forward its unique inheritance. Medical professionals occasionally document children born with irises that shift through spectrums beyond ordinary genetic possibility, violet to silver, amber to obsidian, their gaze containing depths that unsettle even experienced pediatricians. These children demonstrate a remarkable affinity for mathematical concepts beyond their educational level, often creating identical geometric drawings without prior communication or shared influence. Ecological surveys reveal peculiar anomalies surrounding the 7 primary watching places, microbiomes evolving with accelerated complexity, soil samples containing crystalline structures that spontaneously reorganize when observed under microscopic examination, wildlife exhibiting behavioral patterns that correspond to astronomical alignments visible only during specific equinoctial periods. The land itself appears to remember what human consciousness struggles to comprehend. The curator of the Wisconsin Historical Society's restricted collection, a woman whose heterochromatic eyes shift from emerald to amber with seasonal regularity, maintains meticulous records of visitors who express particular interest in the Aldridge documentation. These individuals invariably share certain physiological markers, slightly elongated pupils, enhanced perception of ultraviolet wavelengths, and dream journals filled with identical symbolic representations of 7-sided geometric structures. As the 7th generation since that fateful night approaches maturity, subtle changes manifest across Wisconsin's landscape. Northern lights appear with increasing frequency, their prismatic curtains forming patterns that momentarily resolve into recognizable glyphs before dissolving back into atmospheric phenomena. Certain locations experience temporal anomalies, moments where observers report time briefly flowing at different rates within precisely defined boundaries. Children born near the watching places demonstrate an intuitive understanding of mathematical principles that established science has yet to formally recognize. The transformation continues, not through catastrophic rupture, but through gradual, willing integration. Consciousness expanding beyond individual limitation toward a composite awareness that perceives reality through frameworks simultaneously human and other. What approaches is neither apocalypse nor salvation, but evolution's next iterative expression, a perceptual doorway opening not through violent breach, but through patient, deliberate preparation across generations. Wisconsin itself has become the vessel, its geography transformed into a living calculation, the final equation approaching completion with each child born carrying the watching blood, each stone fragment gradually aligning with its counterparts across continental distance, and each consciousness awakening to perception beyond ordinary human limitation. When the snow falls upon Wisconsin between the solstice and the equinox, those with watching blood hear a different music in the winter wind. Not merely the hollow keening through barren branches, but harmonics that resonate with mathematical precision. The seventh generation has reached maturity now. Their altered eyes perceive the world through frameworks simultaneously human and beyond. They recognize one another in passing without words, a silent acknowledgement passing between them like electricity across a synapse. The former Aldridge property remains unclaimed, its boundaries unmarked on modern maps, yet universally avoided by developers and hikers alike. The depression where the homestead once stood has transformed into a perfect circular pool that reflects not the sky above, but impossible geometries that shift when viewed from different angles. On the 7th day of the 7th month, when summer heat shimmers across Wisconsin's landscape, these children of altered vision gather at the water's edge. Their reflection in the pool shows not their human forms, but crystalline structures of light and shadow. They come bearing river stones collected from 7 watersheds, each polished by time and human touch into gleaming ovoids that catch the sunlight with prismatic brilliance. No words pass between them as they arrange these offerings in constellation patterns corresponding to celestial alignments visible only during the moment when day and night achieve perfect balance. When the final stone completes the pattern, the air above the pool shimmers with opalescent light, a momentary thinning of reality's fabric rather than a tearing. Through this permeable threshold, perception expands beyond individual limitation. Those gathered perceive themselves not merely as discrete consciousnesses, but as expressions of a larger awareness that extends backward through their ancestry and forward into potentialities yet unrealized. The watching places and the watching eyes become one continuous perception, human consciousness and otherworldly awareness achieving communion rather than conquest. The transformation manifests not in physical metamorphosis, but in the dissolution of boundaries between observer and observed, past and future, individual and collective. 7 minutes that exist outside conventional temporal measurement. They experience reality through facets rather than through linear progression. A kaleidoscopic perception that comprehends pattern and meaning across dimensions ordinarily filtered from human consciousness. When a moment passes, they depart in silence, returning to lives that straddle ordinary existence and extraordinary awareness. They carry within them not merely altered vision, but expanded comprehension, the ability to recognize in Wisconsin's landscape the living calculation approaching its final resolution. Through their bloodline, the ancient intelligences achieve what the ritual beneath the oak sought to accomplish: gradual integration rather than sudden transformation. The land remembers what was and anticipates what approaches, not with dread, but with patient acceptance of evolution's inevitable expression. Wisconsin watches, and through altered eyes, is watched in return. The circle remains unbroken across generations, the spiral continuing its measured revolution toward a future where perception itself transforms the nature of reality.